80,000 soldiers, a fortress they called the Gibraltar of the East, and a surrender that shattered an empire. How did the strongest British base in Asia fall in just 70 days? Imagine a fortress so strong it was called the Gibraltar of the East. It's early 1942. The British Empire is bleeding in Europe, fighting the Nazis. But here in Singapore, the officers are sipping gin and tonics at the Raffles Hotel. The mood isn't fear, not yet. It's arrogance. They believed the jungle to the north was impenetrable. They trusted the Royal Navy would save them. And deep down, many believed no Asian army could defeat a European power. But in just 7 days, this entire illusion would collapse. This isn't just the story of a lost battle. This is the story of a fatal decision born from pure, unfiltered hubris. Welcome to history's fatal decisions. Today, we are looking at the moment the sun finally began to set on the British Empire. To understand what went wrong, you have to look at the map. Singapore is an island at the tip of the Malaya Peninsula, a tiny diamond at the edge of the world's most important shipping lanes. The British spent years and millions of pounds building massive coastal guns, 15-inch monster cannons designed to smash enemy battleships into driftwood. These guns were the ultimate deterrent, symbolic of an empire that ruled the waves. And they were magnificent, if the Japanese had been polite enough to attack from the sea. But the Singapore strategy had a fatal flaw. It relied on a fleet that, when the moment came, simply wasn't there. London promised that if Singapore was ever threatened, a massive naval task force would sail to its rescue. But when the time came, Britain was fighting for its life in the Atlantic. Only 2 major ships were sent, the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse. Within days of the Japanese invasion, both were at the bottom of the South China Sea, sunk by Japanese aircraft. The invincible shield was gone before the battle even truly began. The Japanese commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya, had no intention of playing by British rules. He looked at the map and saw what the British refused to see. The back door was wide open. The British had virtually no defenses facing north, towards the mainland. Why? Because the jungle there was thick, swampy and dangerous. The British commanders looked at those mangroves and said, "No army can move tanks through that." Nature, they thought, was their shield. But nature doesn't pick sides. Yamashita didn't just move through the jungle, he weaponized it. While the British were waiting for battleships, the Japanese were pedaling. Not tanks, not armored divisions. Bicycles. Simple steel frames cutting through the jungle. Thousands of Japanese troops were moving down the Malay Peninsula on simple bicycles. When they hit a destroyed bridge, they carried the bikes across their shoulders on log bridges. When their tires blew out from the heat, they rode on the metal rims. The sound of metal grinding on asphalt sounded like tanks to the terrified retreating troops. This was a masterclass in speed and logistics. The British forces were road-bound, heavy, and slow. They were constantly outflanked. Every time they set up a defensive line, the Japanese were already behind them. Panic started to spread. Not just among the soldiers, but in the command center. Enter Lieutenant-General Arthur Percival. History has been hard on Percival, and for good reason. He was a brave man, but he was a manager, not a warrior. He was facing a psychological blitzkrieg, and he froze. As the Japanese closed in on the island, Percival's subordinates begged him, "Sir, we need to build defenses on the north shore. Trenches, barbed wire, machine gun nests, now." And here lies the fatal decision. He argued that building visible defenses would damage morale. That decision would cost him everything. He didn't want to scare the civilians or the troops by admitting the enemy might actually reach the island. It's a mistake leaders make again and again, protecting the image of strength instead of dealing with reality. So, While the Japanese were sharpening their bayonets and crossing the Johor Strait in collapsible boats, the British soldiers were stopped from digging in. They literally watched the enemy approach with no cover. It wasn't just a miscalculation. It was a decision that left the island exposed. On February 8th, the Japanese crossed the Johor Strait. It was brutal, confusing, and over far too quickly. The Australian troops defending the beaches fought hard, but they were spread too thin, covering miles of coastline with no depth to their defense. The Japanese wave broke through. Once the Japanese were on the island, the situation turned from a military defeat into a humanitarian nightmare. Within days, they had captured the reservoirs. This was the checkmate. Singapore, a city of 1 million people, was running out of water. The pipes were shattered by constant artillery fire. Bodies were piling up in the streets. The heat was unbearable, a humid, tropical hell. The smell of burning oil from the sabotaged naval base and the scent of death hung over the city. The fortress, so carefully built, so proudly defended, had become a trap. In London, the reality hadn't set in. Winston Churchill telegraphed, "There must be no thought of saving the troops or sparing the population. The battle must be fought to the bitter end." It was a command for a glorious suicide. Easy to say from a bunker in London. Much harder when you are in the middle of a city where the hospital, the Alexandra Hospital, was being stormed by Japanese troops who bayoneted doctors and patients alike. Percival knew that every hour he delayed surrender, thousands more civilians would die. But here is the twist that makes this story truly tragic. The Japanese were running on empty. Yamashita was terrified. His troops were exhausted. Their supply lines stretched to the breaking point across the Malayan jungle. Yamashita was running dangerously low on ammunition. A determined counterattack might have forced him to reconsider his advance. In reality, the British outnumbered the Japanese nearly 3-1. Percival had over 80,000 men. Yamashita had barely 30,000 in his frontline divisions. If Percival had known how thin Yamashita's position really was, he might have taken the risk. But he didn't. But Yamashita knew he couldn't win a long battle, so he did the only thing he could. He bluffed. He demanded unconditional surrender immediately, shouting at the British delegation, acting as if he had endless reserves and was ready to level the city. And Percival, tired, broken, and fearing a massacre of civilians, folded. February 15, 1942. It is the Chinese New Year, the year of the horse. But for Singapore, it was the year of the grave. General Percival walks down a road to the Ford Motor Factory to meet Yamashita. He is wearing oversized shorts and knee-high socks, looking thin, pale, and utterly defeated. It remains the largest capitulation in British military history. 80,000 men surrendered to a force less than half their size. The aftermath was brutal. For the soldiers, it meant years of starvation and slave labor on the Death Railway in Burma. For the local Chinese population, it meant the Suk Ching, a systematic purge that led to the execution of tens of thousands. But the damage went even deeper. The image of a British general surrendering to an Asian commander sent shockwaves through the colonies. From the streets of Delhi to the jungles of Vietnam, the message was clear. The old masters were not invincible. The illusion of European invincibility shattered that afternoon on a road in Singapore. The British would eventually return to Singapore in 1945, but they returned to a world that no longer believed in their right to rule. The fall of Singapore wasn't just about guns pointing the wrong way. It wasn't just about bicycles or water reservoirs. It was about a mindset that refused to adapt to a changing world. It was the price of arrogance, the belief that your enemy is inferior simply because they are different. General Percival wanted to protect morale, but instead he lost an army he chose not to admit how bad the situation really was. And that choice ended the battle. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's darkest strategic failures, make sure to subscribe to History's Fatal Decisions. We have more stories of empires, errors, commercial disasters, and the human cost of bad leadership coming soon.